Well, I think one of the problems about the Indian situation is this, that in many ways it looks peculiar that India should be a country with as much problem as we actually do have. It's a country which has been blessed with a successful attempt at democracy. In fact, it's important to recall that when India became a democracy, at the end of the time when the British left in 1947, there was a gigantic set of meetings going on in the Constituent Assembly, which arrived at a democratic constitution. Extraordinarily interesting, lots of discussion about the shape of Indian democracy. And with the participation of some of the finest minds, produced a democratic constitution. I was transiting from school to college at that time, and I remember viewing with some skepticism as to whether we would succeed, but we did. And yet something oddly has gone wrong in the sense that if we look at the situation in India today, in many respects it's really a kind of shocking situation with literacy, still about a third of the females and a substantial proportion of the males still illiterate. India having the highest ratio of undernourished kids in the world. There are kind of debates about criteria of undernourishment, but no matter which way you measure it, it's very high. Immunization rate still shockingly low, actually. If you look at the triple immunization, which should be quite easy to deliver, is still only 72% among the children, and compared with China's 99%, Bangladesh is increasingly getting close to 90%. The oddity is that all this has been happening with fairly good performance in growth, which has declined very recently, and every time that happens, there are tremendous panic for those who tend to judge everything in terms of just economic growth, and we have predictably seeing that. But India's growth story is very peculiar. Sometimes it's missed how the growth story began pretty early, because it's quite standard to say that India used to have very low economic growth. Certainly it's true. Low economic growth in the sense that in the first couple of decades it was going at 3.5% a year. Now, 3.5% a year, of course, is a kind of European dream today. That's not a standard to go by. But you have to remember that the rate of growth of the Indian economy in the first half century, that is before independence, was less than 1% per year. And in fact, the per capita income was going at 0.1% a year. And compared with that, a 3.5% was quite a big jump indeed, immediately. But then it slowly went 4%, 5% by about the 80s, then the 90s, still only 5%, but it was laying the basis of much further growth rate in the 90s and in the late 90s and the last decade. So beginning from 92 to now, so it's now 20 years, there have been changes. India's income per capita is now about 3 or 4 times what it was then. In India, it's more than 5.5 times what it was when India became independent. India was one of the poorest countries in the world, and is still one of the poorest countries, but it's not because there haven't been any progress. And in the quite a lot of the last decade, India was the second fastest growing economy in the world, large economy in the world, following China, and at many stages it looked as if it was closing in on China. China growing at 9%, 10%, and India growing 8.5%. And a lot of people are really concerned about catching up with China in terms of growth rate. But of course, one of the peculiar things is that this is also a period when the Chinese went to universal literacy. They went fairly early. That happened actually before the economic reforms, that even in the Maoist period, they were very concerned about literacy. That was one of the actually communist commitments that they had. Also, a universal health care of a very low quality, but nevertheless universal coverage. And there China had a bit of a setback in the immediately after reform. The Chinese used to be totally suspicious of the market economy, which didn't serve its economy well, and its agriculture was a chaos, real chaos. Its industries were performing very much below its ability. So when in 1979 the reform came, that anti-market suspicion was drowned, and that was a victory for intelligent, open-minded planning. But Chinese moved from a complete anti-market position to being completely pro-market position. So they marketized everything, including health insurance. And one jump, they moved from a position like Canada to a position like the United States, with a much lower level of income, and that, as you will recognize, was not an improvement. The result, of course, was the coverage fell from 100% to 10 to 12% between 1979 and 1981. And you see these, in this book which Christina kindly mentioned, that we discuss how much the Chinese progress in longevity slowed down. But then they recognized that things were going wrong. I was privileged to be involved with the Peking University. In fact, I still chair the advisory, international advisory board of the Development Institute of Peking University. And I saw many people in the university were quite upset about it. They wanted to go back to a universal coverage. But the battle took some time. But by around 2000, it was quite clear that the critique was getting traction. And 2004, the Chinese decided to reverse it. And of course, in characteristic Chinese efficiency, they moved from there to near universal coverage in the course of about 6 or 7 years. It has coverage of about 96, 97% now. But actually, while Indians were talking about catching up on growth rate, there was very little talk about catching up with China in general. The Chinese had a life expectancy which is 10 years longer than India's. Literacy rate close to 100%, whereas India's lagging behind. Medical coverage nearly 100%. Now, all that was happening while India was growing, and I was surprised in some ways that it was continuing to go for so long, because there were problems even then, and of course these problems have really come out more strongly now. When people ask me, was I surprised that when the Indian growth rate slowed down? And I said, no, I've not been, because I was fearing this might happen, and it did. Well, let's postpone that story there. I want to come back to it as to what might have been going wrong there. Just forget China now. Just think about India. So here the economy growing fast, leaving the colonialism behind. The British Empire began with a gigantic famine of 1770. It ended with the gigantic famine of 1943, which as a child I actually witnessed because it was all around me in Bengal. There was no famine since then. there were many other achievements, but something went deeply wrong. And those who look for inequality in Gini coefficient and so on would say, look, what are you grumbling about? The inequality level is not so high in India, and indeed so. There was a little statistical folly in that, because Indians had expenditure inequality, whereas all countries like China, Brazil, Russia, and others compared with that had income inequality. Anyone who was involved with this kind of economics knows that inequality in expenditure tends to be less than in income. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. If you're interested, we can discuss it. But then when you correct it, now we have actually income inequality figures, reasonable one. And it's higher than we thought. But on the other hand, it's not higher than in China. It's about the same. The Chinese inequality has grown over this year of huge progress, so has India's. The Chinese have grown a little bit more than India's. But then, what's the problem? I mean, India was growing almost as fast as China. Its inequality level was not higher than that of China. It wasn't increasing faster than China. So what went wrong?